In the dazzling, high-stakes world of mid-century New York society, the world Truman Capote would claim as his kingdom, there were the stars, and then there was the woman who watched them. She wasn't one of his glittering swans, those impossibly perfect creatures like Babe Paley or Slim Keith. She lacked their ethereal beauty, their dramatic lives. Her name was Margaret Case Harriman, and she was something far rarer, a brilliant writer for The New Yorker and the ultimate insider-outsider. As the daughter of the legendary Algonquin Hotel's proprietor, Margaret grew up with the wits of the Algonquin Round Table as her uncles. This gave her unparalleled access, allowing her to chronicle Broadway stars, Hollywood legends, and the figures of cafe society. She interviewed the Swans long before Capote ever named them, but she never truly belonged. She was the woman who meticulously documented Capote's glittering universe, but always maintained a crucial distance, perpetually on the edge, looking in. This is not the story of a swan, destined for tragic glamour. This is the story of the quiet, intelligent observer who understood that world better than anyone, precisely because she was never fully part of it. This is Margaret Case Harriman, the woman who chronicled Capote's world, but never entered it. To truly understand Margaret Case Harriman, her voice, her perspective, her unique blend of intimacy and detachment, you have to understand the utterly unique, almost mythical ecosystem where she spent her formative years. She wasn't just near the center of New York's cultural universe in the early 20th century. She lived, quite literally, inside it, breathing its rarefied, witty, and often toxic air from her very first day. Margaret was born in 1904. Her father was Frank Case, a figure almost as legendary, in his own quiet way, as the institution he managed and later owned, the Algonquin Hotel, located just steps from Broadway on West 44th Street. Today, the Algonquin is a venerable landmark hotel, cherished for its rich literary history, its tradition of hosting a resident cat, and its slightly faded clubby Edwardian charm. It feels like stepping into a preserved amber of a bygone era. But in the 1910s and 1920s, the period encompassing Margaret's entire childhood and adolescence, the Algonquin was not merely a hotel. It was the white-hot, vibrant, electrifying center of New York's theatrical, literary, journalistic, and artistic world. It wasn't just a hotel for travelers. It was a permanent clubhouse, an annex to Broadway and the newspaper offices of Times Square, ruled with urbane wit by Frank Case. Frank Case wasn't just a hotel manager in the modern corporate sense. He was a curator of personalities, a masterful impresario of atmosphere. He understood instinctively that the real luxury he offered wasn't just comfortable beds or efficient room service. It was the intoxicating blend of conversation, creative energy, and a certain permissive tolerance for eccentricity. He cultivated a fiercely loyal clientele of actors, playwrights, critics, novelists, poets, journalists, and assorted wits, often extending them generous lines of credit, turning a discreetly blind eye to their sometimes raucous behavior, and providing a space, specifically the hotel's restaurants and lobby, where they could meet, drink, gossip, argue, collaborate, fall in and out of love, and crucially, perform for each other. The Algonquin was their stage, and Frank Case was the quiet, knowing director. And the most famous, most mythologized manifestation of this curated chaos was, of course, the Algonquin Round Table. From roughly 1919, shortly after the end of the First World War, until the end of the Roaring Twenties, a shifting constellation of New York's sharpest, funniest, most ambitious, and often most poisonously cruel minds gathered almost daily for lunch in the hotel's Rose Room. The names still resonate, carrying the faint scent of bathtub gin and cigarette smoke. Dorothy Parker, the queen of melancholy wit, whose epigrams could wound or delight with equal precision. Robert Benchley, the humorist whose gentle, befuddled persona masked a rapier intelligence. George S. Kaufman, the playwright and director, a master craftsman of Broadway comedy, known for his devastating put-downs. Edna Ferber, the best-selling novelist, chronicler of the American landscape. Alexander Woollcott, the corpulent, effeminate, and famously irascible drama critic for the New York Times, whose pronouncements could make or break a play. Robert E. Sherwood, the towering playwright who would later write speeches for FDR. Franklin P. Adams, the popular newspaper columnist whose recordings of the table's banter helped spread their fame. And Harold Ross, the rough-around-the-edges, perpetually exasperated newspaperman who in 1925 would harness the Round Table's chaotic energy to found a magazine called The New Yorker. These were the founding figures of modern American wit, the architects of a certain sarcastic, knowing, urban sensibility that would ripple through the culture for decades. Their bons mots, often polished and improved in the retelling, were eagerly repeated in gossip columns and across dinner tables. Their feuds were legendary, their practical jokes elaborate, their collaborations changed the face of Broadway comedy, and with Ross's magazine, American journalism itself. They were, in essence, the first modern media celebrities, famous as much for their personalities as for their work. This glittering, supercharged, and often intimidating world was the literal physical environment Margaret Case grew up in. Not as a member, of course. She was just a child, the proprietor's daughter, but as a ubiquitous, observant, and largely overlooked presence. Imagine being a sensitive, intelligent little girl, perhaps trying to do your arithmetic homework in a quiet corner of the hotel lobby, while Dorothy Parker, perched precariously on a banquette, trades devastatingly clever barbs with Robert Benchley a few feet away. Imagine the scent of their cigarettes, the clinking of their cocktail glasses, the bursts of performative laughter. Imagine having Noel Coward, a frequent guest and honorary member of the circle, casually playing the piano in your family's private living room. Imagine having Alexander Woollcott, whose personality swung wildly between sentimental affection and terrifying bursts of temper, read you bedtime stories, perhaps Grimm's fairy tales, delivered with his own dramatic, critical annotations. Or imagine him critiquing your choice of pajamas with the same acidic wit he applied to Broadway openings. Imagine Harold Ross pacing the lobby, muttering about deadlines and incompetent writers, perhaps stopping to gruffly ask you if you knew the proper use of a semicolon. It was an education unlike any other, far exceeding anything she might learn in a conventional classroom. She learned through total immersion, the rhythm of wit, the delicate art of the anecdote, the crucial importance of the perfectly timed pause, the devastating power of the unexpected put-down. She absorbed, almost unconsciously, the relentless performance of self that characterized nearly all the Round Table members. They were always on stage, even at lunch. She saw firsthand, from the privileged vantage point of childhood invisibility, the complex, often exhausting machinery involved in the construction of fame. She saw the moments of brilliance, but also the moments of insecurity, the heavy drinking, the professional jealousies, the often lonely reality that lay beneath the glittering, witty facade. She learned, perhaps most crucially, that the people who seemed the most effortlessly clever were often working the hardest at it. Her father, Frank Case, was the quiet anchor in this whirlwind. Though surrounded by literary lions, he was a writer himself, the author of 2 charming anecdotal memoirs about his life at the hotel, Tales of a Wayward Inn and Do Not Disturb, which reveal a gently humorous, observant, and remarkably tolerant perspective. He seems to have adored his daughter, Margaret, his only child. Frank Case, a man of innate dignity and quiet wit, nurtured her curiosity and taught her the value of discretion and the art of seeing the small, telling detail that reveals a person's true character. He gave her unparalleled access to this extraordinary world, but he also seems to have instilled in her a certain necessary professional detachment. They were the hosts, the facilitators, the slightly bemused keepers of this dazzling, chaotic zoo. They were not, and should never aspire to be, the star attractions themselves. This subtle distinction, learned at her father's knee, would become the bedrock of her own authorial voice. This unique childhood created the perfect conditions, the ideal psychological laboratory, for the writer Margaret would eventually become. She was steeped in the world of celebrity, literature, and theater, completely comfortable and unintimidated in its presence, yet she was never fully absorbed by it. She was always, by virtue of her position as the proprietor's daughter, slightly apart. She understood the intricate mechanics of fame, the subtle nuances of social performance, the often vast gap between the public persona and the private self, precisely because she had watched it all being constructed, rehearsed, and sometimes painfully dismantled from the wings since her earliest memory. She carried the Algonquin within her, not just as a collection of anecdotes, but as a way of seeing the world. As the Roaring Twenties sputtered to a close with the stock market crash of 1929, and the ensuing Great Depression cast a long shadow over the city, the specific constellation of the Round Table began to dissipate. Its members moved on to Hollywood, to greater fame, to alcoholism, to early deaths. The daily lunches became less frequent, the wit perhaps less sparkling, tinged with a growing disillusionment. But the Algonquin Hotel itself remained a vital hub, a symbol of a certain enduring New York sophistication. And the spirit of that sophisticated urban wit, ironic, observant, literate, and deeply engaged with the texture of modern life, found its new, more permanent, and arguably more influential home in the steadily thickening pages of the New Yorker magazine. Founded by Round Table veteran Harold Ross back in 1925, the magazine was hitting its stride in the 1930s, evolving from a struggling humor publication into the sophisticated, indispensable chronicle of urban life, culture, and politics that it remains today. It was into this world, the world of Harold Ross, of carefully calibrated prose, of obsessive fact-checking, of sophisticated cartoons, the world her entire childhood had perfectly, if unintentionally, prepared her for, that Margaret Case Harriman would now step. She would leave behind the role of the quiet observer in the hotel lobby and take her place, not as the manager's daughter, but as a writer in her own right, poised and ready to chronicle the next generation of glittering, complex, and often troubled figures who inhabited the heart of the city she knew so intimately. She had served her long, unique apprenticeship simply by living. Now it was finally time to write it all down. Margaret Case's transition from the Algonquin's perpetually observant daughter to a professional writer wasn't instantaneous, marked by a single dramatic debut. It was more of a gradual, almost inevitable evolution, growing up literally breathing the same air as the most celebrated writers in America. The allure of the printed word, the intoxicating power of a well-turned phrase, the sheer glamour of seeing one's name in print was inescapable. While details of her formal education remained somewhat scant, she attended schools in New York, including the progressive Lincoln School, but doesn't seem to have pursued a university degree in the conventional, expected manner for a young woman of her background. Her real and far more potent education took place daily, hourly, in the bustling lobbies, the clattering dining rooms, and the hushed private suites of her father's extraordinary hotel. She listened, sharpening her ear for dialogue, the real education the Algonquin gave her. Her father, the affable and literate Frank Case, actively encouraged her intellectual curiosity and her nascent writing talent. He was, by all accounts, a devoted and supportive father, and Margaret, his only surviving child, adored him. Their relationship, seemingly built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared humor and quiet understanding, formed the stable, loving core of her often unconventional, celebrity-adjacent upbringing. He provided the anchor in the glittering, often emotionally turbulent sea of famous personalities that washed through their lives. Her first significant professional foray into the world of writing wasn't directly for The New Yorker, but for another glossy magazine that perfectly captured the high-spirited, artistic, and often snobbish zeitgeist of the late Jazz Age and early Depression era. Vanity Fair, under the legendary taste-making editorship of Frank Crowninshield. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Margaret began contributing short pieces, often light, sharply observational essays or humorous, slightly satirical takes on modern manners, social trends, and the peculiar habits of the urban sophisticate. It was here, in the stylish pages graced by the likes of Dorothy Parker herself, Robert Benchley, Claire Booth Luce, and Noel Coward, that she started to truly hone her distinctive voice, a voice characterized by its dry wit, its keen eye for absurdity, its sophisticated detachment, and its undercurrent of knowing, Algonquin-bred irony. She was learning to write for an audience that expected intelligence, humor, and a certain insider perspective. Her deep intrinsic connection to the Algonquin, however, remained her most valuable professional asset. It provided not only an inexhaustible wellspring of material, anecdotes, character sketches, behind-the-scenes glimpses of fame, but also, crucially, the necessary contacts. Harold Ross, the notoriously irascible, perpetually disheveled yet utterly brilliant founder and editor of The New Yorker, had been a core member of the Round Table and a longtime friend and patron of her father's hotel. Ross, despite his rough-hewn, non-literary background, possessed an almost mystical reverence for talent and an obsessive, near-pathological commitment to journalistic accuracy and stylistic clarity. It was almost inevitable that Margaret, with her impeccable Algonquin pedigree and her developing writing skills, would find her way into the orbit of his strange, chaotic, uniquely demanding, and utterly groundbreaking magazine. Joining The New Yorker in the early 1930s was like stepping onto a moving train, a high-speed engine forging a completely new kind of American journalism. Ross, aided by his indispensable editorial partners, Catherine Angel and William Shawn, was creating a magazine unlike any other. It aimed to be literate without being stuffy, nuanced without being obscure, factually rigorous, and deeply, almost obsessively focused on the intricate life of New York City. He attracted, and somehow managed, a stable of extraordinary, often deeply eccentric writers, E.B. White, James Thurber, Joseph Mitchell, Janet Flanner, A.J. Liebling, St. Clair McKelway, who were collectively creating a prose style that was simultaneously sophisticated and accessible, ironic and deeply human, meticulously reported and beautifully crafted. The New Yorker wasn't just a magazine. It was becoming the arbiter of urban sophistication, the voice of a certain modern knowing sensibility. Margaret Case fit right in, almost seamlessly. She began, as many aspiring New Yorker writers did, by contributing short, unsigned pieces to the magazine's iconic front-of-book section, The Talk of the Town. These pieces, brief, anecdotal, often humorous snapshots capturing the fleeting moments, curious characters, overheard conversations, and minor absurdities of New York life, were the perfect training ground for her observational talents. Her Algonquin background gave her an innate, almost instinctive understanding of the magazine's famously elusive tone, that unique, sophisticated blend of insider knowledge and slightly amused anthropological distance. She knew how to capture the voice of the city, its rhythms, its pretensions, its fleeting moments of beauty and absurdity, precisely because she had grown up listening intently to its most articulate and often most eccentric inhabitants. She could write about Broadway producers, society matrons, or eccentric taxi drivers with the same knowing, understated wit. But her real strength, the particular niche she would carve out for herself within the demanding ecosystem of Ross's magazine, was the profile. The New Yorker profile, largely shaped in its early years by Ross himself and pioneering writers like Alva Johnston and Wolcott Gibbs, was a distinct literary form. It was emphatically not the gushing, publicity-driven fan magazine piece churned out by Hollywood studios, nor was it the dry, formal biographical sketch found in encyclopedias. It was something different, a detailed, often lengthy, deeply researched, and psychologically astute portrait of a personality in action. It aimed to capture the essence of its subject, not just through a recitation of facts and accomplishments, but through meticulous reporting. The accumulation of revealing anecdotes, the careful observation of manners and environment, and crucially, through a carefully crafted, often subtly ironic prose style. The goal was to reveal character through action and detail, to show rather than simply tell. Margaret excelled at this demanding form, arguably becoming one of its most skilled and prolific practitioners during the magazine's golden age. She possessed a rare gift for getting people, often notoriously guarded or self-important people, to talk, to open up, perhaps precisely because her quiet, observant, slightly self-effacing manner put them at ease. She wasn't threatening. She wasn't a competitor vying for the spotlight. She wasn't trying to psychoanalyze them overtly. She presented herself as the interested, intelligent listener, genuinely curious about their lives and work. This disarming quality, combined with the formidable reputation of the New Yorker itself, granted her extraordinary access. Furthermore, she had an almost uncanny ability, likely honed during those years eavesdropping at the Algonquin, to recall dialogue accurately and to capture the unique verbal tics, rhythms, and mannerisms of her subjects. Her profiles are remarkably full of direct quotes, long passages where she allows her subjects to reveal themselves consciously or unconsciously in their own words. This technique, combined with her own sharp, witty, and often subtly deflating prose, allowed her to create portraits that felt both authentic and revealing, often exposing the gap between the carefully constructed public persona and the more complex, sometimes contradictory, private individual. Her choice of subjects in these early years perfectly reflected her unique access and her lifelong fascination with the world of performance, both the literal performance on stage and screen and the more subtle, pervasive social performance enacted in the drawing rooms and restaurants of the city. She naturally gravitated towards the stars of Broadway and Hollywood, the figures who, like the round-table wits of her childhood, lived their lives as a kind of public spectacle, meticulously crafting and projecting an image for public consumption. In 1936, she penned a celebrated profile of the legendary actress Helen Hayes, Then considered the First Lady of the American theater. Harriman's piece skillfully captured both Hayes's undeniable on-stage artistry and her surprisingly down-to-earth, almost bourgeois, off-stage personality. A woman devoted to her family, grappling with the challenges of balancing fame and normalcy. It was an empathetic portrait, but one delivered with the characteristic New Yorker refusal to indulge in hagiography. She turned her sharp eye on the famously waspish, impeccably tailored stage and screen actor Clifton Webb, a man whose entire persona was built on an air of effortless, aristocratic disdain. Harriman's profile, published in 1944, delved behind the mask, revealing the meticulous, almost obsessive construction involved in maintaining that flawless facade, hinting at the complex relationship with his ever-present mother, Maybelle, who managed his career and his life. Perhaps one of her most insightful and enduring profiles from this era was her 1941 piece on Cole Porter, the brilliant, enigmatic songwriter whose sophisticated, witty, and often melancholic lyrics perfectly captured the bittersweet glamour of the interwar years. Harriman gained remarkable access to the intensely private Porter, still recovering from the devastating riding accident that had crippled him a few years earlier, but had not dimmed his creative output. Her profile painted a picture of a man living a life of almost unimaginable luxury and social whirl, yet haunted by physical pain and perhaps a deeper, unspoken ennui. She captured his unique blend of high society polish and rigorous artistic discipline, hinting at the shadows beneath the glittering surface without resorting to crude psychologizing. It was a masterpiece of nuanced observation. These were not just quick interviews dashed off after a single meeting. They were immersive, deeply researched portraits. She would spend significant time with her subjects, observing them in their natural habitats, backstage dressing rooms, cluttered with telegrams and half-eaten sandwiches, opulent penthouse apartments overlooking Central Park, noisy rehearsal halls, fashionable restaurants like 21 or the Colony where deals were made and gossip traded. She talked extensively not just to the star, but to their friends, their colleagues, their servants, their rivals. She gathered anecdotes, cross-referenced stories, checked facts with Ross's legendary fastidiousness. She built her profiles piece by meticulous piece, anecdote by revealing, quote, like a skilled mosaic artist, until a recognizable, complex, often contradictory, and deeply human picture emerged from the assembled fragments. Her personal life during this period of intense professional activity also took a more settled shape. Her first marriage, in 1927 at the age of 23 to a businessman named Donald K. Pierce, was brief and relatively undocumented, ending in divorce after only about 2 years. It's a period of her life she rarely, if ever, wrote or spoke about publicly, suggesting it may have been a youthful misstep, a painful experience, or simply an unremarkable chapter overshadowed by what came later. Her second marriage, however, would prove far more enduring and would place her, at least tangentially, closer to the powerful circles of the American establishment she so often observed. In 1933, Margaret Case married Henry Hyde Harriman. This connection requires careful clarification, as it has often been a source of confusion. Henry Harriman was not the famous, globally influential W. Averill Harriman, the railroad heir, diplomat, governor of New York, ambassador to the Soviet Union during World War II, and key figure in democratic politics for half a century. Henry was Averill's less prominent cousin, a man involved in business and finance, but not a major public figure in his own right. The marriage, however, did connect Margaret, through strong family ties, to the powerful, wealthy, and politically influential Harriman dynasty. W. Averill Harriman and his sister Mary Harriman Rumsey were central figures in the American establishment, moving effortlessly between the boardrooms of Wall Street, the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., and the great European capitals. This connection undoubtedly gave Margaret a certain enhanced social standing and potentially opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. It placed her firmly within the broader orbit of the East Coast elite, the world of Groton, Yale, and quiet inherited power. Yet crucially, this connection did not transform Margaret into one of them. She remained first and foremost Margaret Case, the writer, the sharp-eyed observer from the Algonquin. The Harriman name might add a certain luster or provide access to certain drawing rooms, but her fundamental identity, her professional persona, was still rooted in her unique Algonquin past and her demanding New Yorker present. There is no evidence that she ever attempted to leverage the Harriman connection to reinvent herself as a society hostess, a political player, or a grande dame. Her focus, her passion, remained squarely and steadfastly on her writing, on the meticulous craft of capturing personality on the page. She remained the professional witness, not the participant. The marriage to Henry Harriman appears to have been a stable and relatively happy one, providing a quiet, private counterpoint to her public-facing career. They had one child, a son, Anthony Harriman, born in 1935. Motherhood added another dimension to her life, another layer of experience, but it didn't seem to significantly derail her professional output. She continued to write prolifically for The New Yorker throughout the late 1930s and into the demanding years of the Second World War, balancing the responsibilities of family life with the deadlines and pressures of working for Harold Ross. The culmination of her deep, almost umbilical connection to her past came in 1951 with the publication of her most famous and enduring book, The Vicious Circle, the story of the Algonquin Round Table. This was, in many ways, the book she was born to write, the story only she could tell with such intimate, first-hand authority. Drawing heavily on her own unique childhood memories, supplemented by extensive interviews with the surviving members of the group, and undoubtedly enriched by her father's own trove of anecdotes and reminiscences, she created a vivid, anecdotal, immensely readable, and hugely entertaining portrait of the legendary group during its heyday in the 1920s. It was not and did not pretend to be a critical, objective, or deeply analytical history. It was, rather, an affectionate, often nostalgic, and highly selective look back at a golden, irrecoverable age. It celebrated the wit, the camaraderie, the legendary practical jokes, and the sheer dazzling verbal firepower of Parker, Benchley, Kaufman, Woolcott, and the rest, largely glossing over the darker aspects, the heavy drinking, the professional backstabbing, the deep insecurities, the cruelty that often laced their humor. Harriman wrote from the perspective of someone who had loved these difficult, brilliant people, or at least been endlessly fascinated by them. The book was perfectly timed, appearing just as America was on the brink of entering another world war, offering a nostalgic escape to a seemingly wittier, more carefree time. It was a runaway bestseller and instantly cemented Margaret Case Harriman's reputation as the definitive popular chronicler of that legendary milieu. It remains a classic of its kind, the first and still, arguably, the most influential popular account of the Round Table, profoundly shaping the public perception and the enduring myth of the group for generations to come. Through the harrowing years of the Second World War and into the profoundly changed landscape of the late 1940s and 1950s, Margaret Case Harriman remained a consistent and valued fixture at The New Yorker. Her style, her subjects, and her uniquely informed perspective were perfectly attuned to the magazine's evolving post-war sensibility. This was the era when the magazine, now under the increasingly influential, though still officially secondary, editorial guidance of William Swan, solidified its reputation for unparalleled literary excellence, sophisticated long-form journalism, complex fiction, and incisive cultural commentary. The world Margaret had grown up with, the relatively intimate, clubby world of Broadway premieres, literary lunches, speakeasies, and transatlantic voyages, was rapidly evolving into the new, faster, brighter, more ruthlessly media-saturated world of television, mass celebrity culture, international jet travel, and the phenomenon known as café society. And Margaret was there, notebook still discreetly in hand, observing the transition with her customary acuity. She continued to write profiles, turning her sharp, witty, yet increasingly subtle gaze on the new generation of stars, personalities, and power brokers who populated this post-war landscape. She wrote about colorful restaurateurs like Toots Shor, whose eponymous Manhattan restaurant became a legendary smoke-filled hangout for athletes like Joe DiMaggio, politicians, Broadway characters, and journalists, a kind of boisterous, less literary successor to the Algonquin itself. She profiled figures from the burgeoning, often bewildering world of television, trying to make sense of this new powerful medium and the personalities it created. And significantly for our story, she began to document, with her characteristic blend of fascination and detachment, the lives of the women who were becoming the new arbiters of style, social power, and public fascination. The very women who, in the hothouse imagination of a young Truman Capote, would soon be elevated to the status of near-mythical swans. Her 1955 profile of Gloria Vanderbilt is a fascinating, almost prescient example. Vanderbilt, even then, was a figure of almost overwhelming public recognition. She was the poor little rich girl of the sensational, scandalous custody battle of the 1930s, a young, strikingly beautiful, and immensely wealthy heiress struggling under the weight of her own fame to forge an independent identity as an artist, actress, and designer. Harriman's profile captured, with remarkable empathy and nuance, the unique, almost surreal blend of staggering privilege, deep-seated vulnerability, and restless artistic ambition that defined the young Vanderbilt. It was written with genuine warmth, acknowledging the constraints and expectations placed upon her subject, but also with that characteristic Case/Harriman detachment, observing the careful performance of self even as it described the genuine search for authenticity. She noted the carefully curated perfection of Vanderbilt's appearance, the almost professional deployment of charm, while simultaneously revealing the flashes of uncertainty and longing beneath the polished surface. This was her unique, enduring gift. She possessed the rare ability to enter these gilded cages, these self-created worlds of immense wealth and studied perfection, observe the rare, beautiful birds within, describe their plumage and their songs with exquisite factual detail, and then leave, returning to her own life, her own perspective, her own slightly worn, horn-rimmed glasses, entirely intact. She was the perfect witness, the reliable, unflappable narrator in a world increasingly defined by illusion, self-invention, and the relentless glare of publicity. Her work, meticulously reported and elegantly written, provided the detailed, factual, and psychologically astute raw material, the foundational observations, that Truman Capote, operating from a far more intimate, emotionally entangled, and ultimately destructive position, would later mine, embellish, distort, and ultimately weaponize in his own brilliant, tragic portrayal of the same world. She was patiently, expertly drawing the intricate, accurate maps of the glittering territories he would eventually, gleefully, burn to the ground. As the 1950s unfolded, bathed in the optimistic glow of post-war prosperity, yet shadowed by the anxieties of the Cold War, the specific ecosystem that Margaret Case Harriman observed so meticulously began to crystallize into the phenomenon we now call cafe society. This wasn't the old inherited Knickerbocker aristocracy of Edith Wharton's New York, nor was it the scrappy bohemian intellectualism of the Algonquin Round Table. It was something new, a potent and intoxicating cocktail mixed from old money, new fortunes, Hollywood glamour, European titles, and the burgeoning power of the media to create and sustain fame. Its natural habitat was not the staid ballrooms of Fifth Avenue mansions, but the dimly lit, strategically mirrored interiors of restaurants like El Morocco, the Stork Club, and Le Pavillon. Its rituals involved air-kissing, table-hopping, whispering secrets to gossip columnists like Walter Winchell or Charlie Knickerbocker, and the constant, subtle yet ruthless jockeying for position. The right table, the right invitation, the right photograph in Vogue or Harper's Bazaar. And its high priestesses, the women whose style, beauty, and social maneuvering set the standard for everyone else, were the very figures Truman Capote would later dub his Swans. Margaret Case Harriman, with her decades-long tenure at the New Yorker and her unparalleled inherited access, was perfectly positioned to document this world. She wasn't a newcomer trying to crash the gates. She had grown up within earshot of its progenitors. She understood the intricate social architecture, the unspoken rules, the delicate balance of power and vulnerability that defined its inhabitants. And crucially, unlike many journalists who were either dazzled by the glamour or morally repulsed by the perceived frivolity, she approached it with her signature blend of curiosity, professionalism, and cool, objective appraisal. She wasn't there to judge nor to emulate. She was there to see. Her profiles during this period offer a fascinating, almost anthropological study of this rarefied tribe. While Capote would later focus almost exclusively on the luminous quartet of Paley, Keith, Guinness, and Guest, Harriman cast her net slightly wider, capturing not just the star swans but also the surrounding figures who made up their glittering constellation. Consider her profile subjects. She wrote about Lily Daché, the flamboyant hat designer whose creations were obligatory adornments for society women. She profiled Mame Boucher, the intensely private, American-born couturier whose understated, impeccably crafted clothes became a uniform for women seeking a certain kind of discreet, old-money elegance. These weren't just fashion pieces, they were sociological studies, examining how these creators shaped and reflected the desires and anxieties of their wealthy clientele. Harriman understood that in this world, clothing wasn't just adornment, it was armor, communication, a statement of belonging or aspiration. She wrote about Elsa Maxwell, the legendary, physically unprepossessing yet socially omnipotent party giver, a woman who wielded guest lists like weapons and whose pronouncements could make or break a social season. Harriman captured Maxwell's relentless energy, her shameless self-promotion, and her uncanny ability to orchestrate social alchemy, mixing Vanderbilts with movie stars, royalty with playwrights, creating the very cafe society buzz she then reported on. Through these profiles, Harriman was essentially mapping the infrastructure of glamour. She was showing her readers not just the beautiful surfaces, but the intricate machinery, the designers, the hostesses, the columnists, the restaurateurs. That kept the entire performance aloft. And yes, she also wrote about the Swans themselves, or at least those who permitted her access. Her approach, however, was fundamentally different from Capote's later, intensely personal, and ultimately parasitic relationship. Harriman was a journalist conducting an interview for a highly respected magazine. Capote was a confidant, a court jester, a surrogate son, and ultimately a spy embedding himself within the flock. While direct, full-length New Yorker profiles by Harriman focusing solely on Babe Paley or Slim Keith are harder to pinpoint, her known body of work and her position meant she inevitably encountered, observed, and likely wrote about these women in various contexts, perhaps within broader pieces about society trends, fashion, or specific events. Her book, And the Past Imperfect, a collection of her profiles and reminiscences, includes sharp, witty portraits of figures adjacent to this world, like Condé Nast himself, the magazine publisher who essentially invented the modern cult of chic. Her methods remained consistent. She would approach her subjects with professional courtesy. She would request interviews, conduct them with her disarming, quiet attentiveness, and supplement them with rigorous research and off-the-record conversations with friends and associates. Her goal was not to capture their innermost secrets or expose their hidden flaws in the way Capote later would. Her aim, true to the New Yorker ethos established by Ross, was to create a fair, accurate, multifaceted portrait based on observable facts, revealing anecdotes and, above all, the subject's own words. Imagine Margaret Case Harriman interviewing, say, Babe Paley, arguably the most beautiful and revered of the Swans. She would likely meet her not for intimate, hours-long lunches filled with gossip and confessions, but perhaps for a more formal scheduled conversation in Paley's impeccably decorated apartment or at a quiet corner table at the Colony. Harriman would listen patiently, her questions polite but probing, her focus on Paley's public role, her famous taste, perhaps her charitable work. She would note the perfection of the setting, the flawless makeup, the quiet, almost hesitant cadence of Paley's voice, the way she deflected personal questions with practiced grace. The resulting profile, had it been written, would likely have been admiring of Paley's beauty and style, perhaps hinting at the discipline and efforts required to maintain such perfection, but it would have respected the carefully constructed boundaries of Paley's public persona. It would have been insightful, elegant, and impeccably fact-checked. It would not have delved into the deep unhappiness of her marriage to Bill Paley, her insecurities, or the private pain behind the perfect facade. That was territory Harriman, operating under the established rules of journalistic decorum, and perhaps her own innate sense of propriety would not have crossed. She was chronicling the performance, not exposing the performer. This fundamental difference in approach brings us to the Capote link. Did Margaret Case Harriman know Truman Capote? Almost certainly. They inhabited the same small overlapping worlds. They attended the same parties, the same gallery openings, the same Broadway premieres. They wrote at times about the same people. Capote, always acutely aware of who was writing what about his chosen milieu, would undoubtedly have read Harriman's pieces in The New Yorker. He might have admired her access and her sharp eye, even while perhaps privately dismissing her work as too cautious, too respectful of the surfaces he longed to penetrate. Harriman, in turn, would have been aware of Capote as the brilliant, precocious, endlessly ambitious young writer making waves first with his Gothic novels, and then increasingly as a chronicler of the very beau monde she herself observed. She might have recognized in him a different kind of observer, one who wasn't content to remain on the outside, but who desperately craved immersion, acceptance, and ultimately possession of the world he described. There's a telling anecdote, possibly apocryphal, but capturing the essence of their differing positions. It's said that Harriman, upon reading one of Capote's early glittering descriptions of his swans, remarked dryly to a friend, "He writes about them as if he invented them. I was writing about them when he was still in short pants." The comment, if true, reveals both her long tenure as an observer and perhaps a touch of professional pique at this flamboyant newcomer claiming her territory. But Capote wasn't just claiming territory. He was fundamentally changing the rules of engagement. While Harriman operated with the traditional journalist's mandate of objective observation, Capote blurred the lines completely. He became their friend, their confidant, their pet genius. He wasn't interviewing Babe Paley. He was dishing gossip with her on the phone for hours, accompanying her on shopping trips, becoming an indispensable part of her inner circle. He wasn't profiling Slim Keith. He was sailing the Mediterranean with her and her husband, Leland Hayward, absorbing every intimate detail of their lives. This level of immersion granted Capote access to a depth of personal revelation, a trove of secrets and vulnerabilities that Harriman, with her more formal approach, could never and likely would never have obtained. But it also came at a profound cost, the cost of journalistic independence and ultimately the cost of human decency. Harriman maintained her distance and thus her integrity as an observer. Capote sacrificed his distance for intimacy, and in doing so, laid the groundwork for his eventual catastrophic act of betrayal with the publication of excerpts from answered prayers. This deepens the exploration of Harriman's outsider status. Why did she remain perpetually on the edge, looking in even with her pedigree and connections? Was it purely a professional choice, a conscious decision to maintain journalistic objectivity? Or was it something deeper, something rooted in her temperament, her background, or perhaps even her appearance? Part of it was undoubtedly professional. The New Yorker ethos, particularly under Ross and later Swan, emphasized a certain cool, detached, almost clinical observation. Writers were expected to be invisible, their personalities subordinate to the story and the facts. Harriman embodied this ethos perfectly. Her prose, while witty, rarely drew attention to herself. She was the clear window pane through which the reader observed the subject. Part of it was likely temperamental. By all accounts, she was a quiet, private, somewhat reserved woman, despite the glittering circles she moved in. She lacked the relentless self-promotional drive of an Elsa Maxwell or the performative charisma of Capote. She seemed genuinely more comfortable listening than talking, observing than being observed. Her childhood in the Algonquin, watching the often exhausting performance of the Round Table wits, might have instilled in her a lifelong aversion to the spotlight. And perhaps part of it was simply that she didn't fit the increasingly narrow aesthetic mold of the world she chronicled. Cafe society, and particularly Capote's Swans, placed an almost tyrannical premium on a certain kind of physical perfection, extreme thinness, flawless features, an air of effortless. Harriman, while described as attractive and always well-dressed, was a more substantial, grounded figure. She looked like a smart, capable professional woman, not an ethereal goddess conjured by Maine Boucher and Cecil Beaton. In a world that was beginning to value image above all else, perhaps her very substance, her lack of performative fragility marked her as inherently other. This outsider perspective, however, was precisely what made her writing so valuable and so enduring. Because she wasn't angling for an invitation to the next exclusive dinner party, because she wasn't emotionally entangled with her subjects, she could see them with a clarity and a lack of illusion that was often missing from Capote's more dazzling but ultimately more compromised prose. She wasn't blinded by love or envy or the desire to belong. She simply saw what was there, and she wrote it down brilliantly. Her father, Frank Case, remained a quiet, steady presence in her life until his death in 1946. His passing marked the end of an era, the severing of her most direct link to the Algonquins' golden age. She wrote movingly about him, not in a formal obituary, but through the affectionate, anecdote-rich style he himself had perfected, capturing his unique blend of kindness, wit, and unflappable discretion. His death likely reinforced her sense of being a bridge between worlds, a custodian of memories from a time that felt increasingly distant. She continued her work for The New Yorker through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, her byline a familiar and trusted presence in its pages. The world was changing rapidly. The rise of television, the emergence of a youth culture, the loosening of social mores, and she documented these shifts with her customary intelligence and wry humor. She wrote about the phenomenon of Marlon Brando, trying to make sense of this new kind of brooding, intensely naturalistic movie star who seemed to defy all the old rules of Hollywood glamour. She observed the changing landscape of Broadway, the rise of musical theater, the shifting tastes of the audience. Her vantage point remained unique. She wasn't a young journalist trying to break in. She was a seasoned veteran, looking at this new world through the lens of her deep historical understanding of the city's cultural and social life. She had seen it all before, or at least versions of it. The names and the hemlines changed, but the fundamental human dramas, the pursuit of fame, the anxieties of status, the performance of self, remained remarkably consistent. As the 1960s began, the world she had so expertly chronicled for 3 decades was poised on the brink of yet another transformation. The carefully ordered universe of cafe society, with its rigid hierarchies and unspoken codes, was about to be blown apart by the cultural and social revolutions of the decade. And the chronicler who had seemed like a harmless, amusing court jester, Truman Capote, was secretly sharpening his knives, preparing to expose the secrets she had so discreetly observed but never revealed. The quiet witness was about to be overshadowed by the devastating confessor. The era of Margaret Case Harriman's subtle, nuanced observation was drawing to a close, soon to be replaced by a louder, crueler, and ultimately more self-destructive form of social commentary. The dawn of the 1960s did not arrive quietly. It was heralded by a palpable shift in the cultural atmosphere, a restlessness that began to subtly undermine the carefully constructed, hermetically sealed world of cafe society that Margaret Case Harriman had so expertly charted. The Eisenhower years, with their emphasis on conformity and quiet prosperity, were giving way to something new, something younger, more energetic, and decidedly less predictable. The election of John F. Kennedy in 1960 brought a new kind of glamour to the forefront, less reliant on inherited titles and Parisian couture, more infused with political power, intellectual vigor, and a youthful, telegenic charisma. Camelot, as it would be retrospectively and perhaps misleadingly dubbed, captured the public imagination in a way that the guest lists at El Morocco no longer quite could. Simultaneously, the art world was undergoing its own seismic shifts. The dominance of abstract expressionism, the heroic, angst-ridden style of Pollock and de Kooning, was being challenged by the cool, ironic surfaces of pop art. Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, and their contemporaries were turning the familiar objects of mass culture, soup cans, comic strips, celebrity photographs, into high art, blurring the lines between commerce and creativity, seriousness and satire in ways that both thrilled and appalled the established arbiters of taste. The world seemed to be getting brighter, louder, faster, and infinitely more disposable. Even fashion, the very bedrock of the Swans universe, was undergoing a revolution. The elegant, structured forms of haute couture, epitomized by Balenciaga and Givenchy, were starting to feel staid, challenged by the youthful exuberance of London's burgeoning mod scene and the rise of ready-to-wear designers who catered to a new, less formal generation. The rules were changing. The carefully guarded gates of exclusivity were beginning to tremble. Where did Margaret Case Harriman stand amidst these swirling currents? She remained, as ever, anchored at the New Yorker, her professional home for nearly 3 decades. Now in her late 50s, she was a seasoned veteran, a respected figure within the magazine's unique culture. While the specific pace of her output might have slowed slightly compared to her prolific earlier years, her byline continued to appear. Her sharp eye and witty prose, still employed to dissect the city's ever-changing social and cultural landscape. She would have observed these shifts not as a participant, but with the long-view perspective of someone who had seen trends come and go, reputations rise and fall. Having chronicled the transition from the Jazz Age to the Depression, from peacetime to wartime, she possessed a historical context that many younger, more easily dazzled observers lacked. She likely viewed the rise of pop art with a certain wry skepticism, perhaps recognizing its energy but questioning its depth, much as her Algonquin mentors might have viewed the latest fleeting Broadway sensation. She would have noted the changing social codes, the subtle shifts in power dynamics, the way new money and new forms of celebrity were altering the topography of Manhattan society. Her own life continued its quiet, steady rhythm, largely removed from the public eye. Her marriage to Henry Harriman provided a stable, private backdrop. Her son, Anthony, was now a young man, presumably making his own way in the world. Her father, Frank Case, and the Algonquin world he represented were receding further into the realm of cherished but increasingly distant memory. She was a woman firmly rooted in her professional identity, her life defined by the rigorous cycle of observation, research, writing, and the famously demanding New Yorker editing process. It was into this subtly shifting yet still intensely status-conscious world that Truman Capote made his most dramatic metamorphosis. He had already achieved significant literary fame with his early novels, like Other Voices, Other Rooms, and the novella Breakfast at Tiffany's, which perfectly captured a certain kind of poignant, amoral glamour. He was a known personality, a fixture in society columns, famous for his high-pitched voice, his outrageous pronouncements, and his cultivation of wealthy, powerful friends, particularly the women he called his Swans. But the Capote of the early 1960s was about to embark on a project that would elevate him from a merely famous novelist to a global literary phenomenon, and simultaneously propel him to the absolute apex of the social world he so desperately courted. In 1959, he read a small news item about the brutal, seemingly motiveless murder of the Clutter family in Holcomb, Kansas. This small spark ignited a monumental 6-year obsession. Capote traveled to Kansas, embedding himself in the community, interviewing everyone connected to the case, and, most controversially, forming intense, complex relationships with the two killers, Perry Smith and Dick Hickok, on death row. The result? Published first as a serialized blockbuster in The New Yorker in late 1965, and then as a book in 1966, was In Cold Blood. It was a masterpiece of reportage and prose, a dark, chilling, and profoundly empathetic exploration of violence, poverty, and the American psyche. Capote called it the nonfiction novel, a claim that ignited fierce debate but cemented the book's groundbreaking status. It was a critical triumph and an unprecedented commercial success, making Capote not just rich, but arguably the most famous writer in America. The contrast between the book's subject matter, the bleak, brutal reality of murder in the American heartland, and Capote's increasingly flamboyant public persona could not have been more stark. As he was plumbing the depths of human darkness in Kansas, he was simultaneously scaling the glittering, treacherous peaks of New York society. His relationship with his swans, particularly Babe Paley, became ever more intense, ever more intimate. He was their confidant, their entertainer, their lapdog genius, privy to their secrets, their fears, their marital disappointments. He was collecting material not just for his magnum opus on the Clutter murders, but secretly for the social novel he dreamed of writing, the book that would expose the hidden lives of the very people who adored him. Margaret Case Harriman, observing this trajectory from her perch at the New Yorker, would have had a unique perspective. She worked at the magazine that was publishing In Cold Blood, witnessing firsthand the meticulous fact-checking process that gave the work its authority, even as whispers about Capote's methods and his relationship with the killers began to circulate. She would have recognized the brilliance of the writing, the sheer narrative power Capote wielded. But she also would have observed his simultaneous, almost manic social ascent with the detached, knowing eye of someone who had seen countless figures strive for that same precarious peak. She had watched the Algonquin wits perform their brilliance, fueled by gin and insecurity. Now she watched Capote perform his, fueled by champagne and an almost insatiable hunger for acceptance. She likely viewed his deep immersion with the Swans with a certain professional skepticism, perhaps sensing the inherent dangers, the loss of objectivity, the potential for exploitation, in becoming not just an observer, but an intimate participant in the lives of one's subjects. It violated the fundamental principle of detachment that had governed her own career and the ethos of her magazine. The culmination of Capote's social triumph, the absolute zenith of his reign as the king of cafe society, came just months after the publication of In Cold Blood. On November 28, 1966, he hosted what would become the most legendary party of the century, the Black and White Ball at the Plaza Hotel. Ostensibly held in honor of Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, the ball was, in reality, a celebration of Truman Capote himself. It was his coronation, his moment to prove that he, the small strange boy from Monroeville, Alabama, now stood at the absolute center of the universe. The guest list was a meticulously curated, almost brutally exclusive cross-section of global power and glamour. His beloved Swans naturally, in their most dazzling jewels and custom-made gowns. Hollywood royalty like Frank Sinatra and Lauren Bacall, political figures like McGeorge Bundy, literary lions like Norman Mailer, artists like Andy Warhol, even European aristocracy. To be invited was to be anointed. To be excluded was a social death sentence. The ball itself was a masterpiece of theatrical self-presentation. The black and white dress code, the mandatory masks, the sheer overwhelming concentration of fame and beauty, it was an event designed for maximum publicity, maximum impact. It was, as Capote intended, the ultimate performance. Was Margaret Case Harriman there? Given her connections, her New Yorker affiliation, her Harriman ties, her long history observing this world, it seems highly probable she would have received an invitation. Whether she attended is harder to confirm definitively without specific documentation, but it's fascinating to imagine her there. Picture her, perhaps in a simple, elegant black dress, her mask chosen for discretion rather than drama, standing quietly near the edge of the swirling, glittering throng in the plaza ballroom. She would not be dancing with abandon or trading intimate secrets with movie stars. She would be watching Capote, tiny and triumphant, flitting between tables, basking in the adoration of the crowd he had so masterfully assembled, watching the Swans, masked and jeweled, performing their roles as goddesses of the night, watching the intricate dance of power, ambition, and social anxiety playing out beneath the surface of the flawless Klieglit glamour. As the seasoned chronicler, the woman who had documented decades of New York society, she would have recognized the ball for what it was, not just a party, but a cultural artifact, a perfect, crystalline expression of a particular moment in time. She would have appreciated the sheer artistry of Capote's social engineering, the audacity of his self-coronation, but her perspective would likely have been tinged with that characteristic Harriman irony, that Algonquin-bred skepticism. She would have seen the performance, but also understood its inherent fragility. She, who had written The Vicious Circle, knew that such moments of peak celebrity, such intense hothouse gatherings, were often the prelude to a fall. She knew that the wit could turn cruel, the adoration could curdle into resentment, the secrets whispered in confidence could eventually be shouted from the rooftops. And there was the unavoidable, almost grotesque juxtaposition that Harriman, with her sharp moral intelligence, could not have missed. The man being celebrated as the king of New York society, the darling of the beautiful people, had achieved this pinnacle on the back of a book about the brutal, squalid, and utterly unglamorous murders of a humble farming family in Kansas. The diamonds glittering in the Plaza Ballroom were, in a sense, refracting the light from the bleak plains of Holcomb. The champagne flowed freely, but the ghosts of the Clutter family, and perhaps even the ghosts of Perry Smith and Dick Hickok, lingered just outside the dazzling circle of light. Capote had brilliantly, chillingly bridged these two impossibly distant worlds, but the inherent tension, the moral dissonance, was profound. Harriman, one suspects, would have felt it acutely. The black and white ball was the peak. It was the moment Capote held the world in the palm of his hand. But even as the flashbulbs popped and the champagne flowed, the seeds of his downfall were already sown. His deep immersion with the Swans, his role as their keeper of secrets, was becoming increasingly dangerous. His desire to write his own À la recherche du temps perdu, his own epic novel exposing the hidden lives of the American aristocracy, was growing into an obsession, and the very success of In Cold Blood, while bringing him fame and fortune, had also taken a profound psychological toll, perhaps exacerbating his insecurities and his reliance on alcohol and drugs. Margaret Case Harriman, continuing her work at The New Yorker, would observe the aftermath. And the very success of In Cold Blood, while bringing him fame and fortune, had also taken a profound psychological toll, perhaps exacerbating his insecurities and his reliance on alcohol and drugs. She, the ultimate insider-outsider, the woman who had always maintained her professional distance, would watch as the ultimate insider, Capote, destroyed himself precisely because he had gotten too close, because he had broken the fundamental rule her father had likely taught her in the lobby of the Algonquin decades before. You can observe the performance, you can chronicle the performers, but you must never, ever betray their trust or reveal what happens after the curtain falls. Capote flew too close to the sun, blinded by its brilliance, and melted his own wings. Harriman, content to observe from a safer altitude, kept hers intact. The spectacle of the black and white ball in November 1966 was, in retrospect, less a coronation and more a magnificent, perfectly orchestrated sunset. It was the moment Truman Capote reached the absolute zenith, holding the glittering, fractious world of high society in the palm of his hand. For Margaret Case Harriman, observing this apotheosis, it must have seemed like the ultimate culmination of the social performance she had chronicled for decades. Here was the Algonquin wit reborn, not as a cynical lunchtime raconteur, but as a media-savvy impresario, directing the entire cast of international power and glamour in his own meticulously staged production. Having documented the rise and fall of countless Broadway shows, literary reputations, and social seasons, Harriman would have possessed a keen, perhaps melancholy, awareness of the ephemeral nature of such triumphs. She knew that the spotlight, once achieved, is notoriously difficult to hold, and that the adulation of the crowd can turn chillingly cold with astonishing speed. She had seen it happen time and again from her unique vantage point at her father's hotel. While Capote basked in the immediate, intoxicating glory of his ball, Harriman, the historian of such moments, might have already sensed the inherent instability, the potential for hubris to curdle into nemesis. Her own life as the 1960s progressed continued its quiet trajectory, increasingly removed from the frantic pace of the world Capote now dominated. Her health, unfortunately, began to decline more seriously in the mid-1960s. Details are scarce, as befitted her private nature, but it appears she was grappling with illnesses that curtailed her formerly active professional life. Her byline appeared less frequently in The New Yorker. The demanding cycle of research, interviewing, writing, and navigating the magazine's famously rigorous editing process became more difficult. This period coincided with seismic shifts in the magazine world itself. While The New Yorker, under William Shawn's careful stewardship, maintained its commitment to long-form journalism and literary quality, other publications were embracing a brasher, more personality-driven style. The new journalism, championed by writers like Tom Wolfe and Gay Talese, immersive, subjective, stylistically flamboyant, was capturing the zeitgeist in a way that the New Yorker's more measured, objective prose sometimes struggled to match. Capote's In Cold Blood, while published in The New Yorker, paradoxically fueled this trend towards the author as star, the narrative as a performance. Harriman's quieter, more self-effacing style, while still respected, perhaps began to feel like a voice from a slightly earlier, less clamorous era. She was becoming like the Algonquin Round Table she had so affectionately memorialized, a figure associated with a past golden age. Her book, The Vicious Circle, remained popular, ensuring her name was still recognized, but her active presence as a chronicler of the current scene was fading. Imagine her, perhaps in her final year, reading the rapturous accounts of Capote's black and white ball, or seeing the endless photographs of him surrounded by his glamorous swans. Would she have felt a pang of envy? Possibly, but it seems more likely, given her temperament and lifelong perspective, that she would have felt a sense of profound irony, perhaps even a quiet professional satisfaction in her own, less dazzling but more durable body of work. She had captured her subjects with precision and wit, but she had never needed their adoration, never compromised her position as the observer. She had remained always Margaret Case, the writer, not Petey, the insider. Her death, when it came, was as quiet and discreet as the way she had lived her life. On July 22, 1967, Margaret Case Harriman died in New York City after a period of illness. She was only 63 years old. Her passing was noted respectfully in the press, particularly in the New York Times, which acknowledged her long association with the New Yorker and her definitive book on the Algonquin Round Table. But it was not a major cultural event. The world's attention was elsewhere, focused on the escalating war in Vietnam, The Summer of Love in San Francisco, the Beatles releasing Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The quiet chronicler slipped away almost unnoticed, just as the world she had documented was itself beginning to fracture and fade. Margaret Case Harriman's death in 1967 means she did not live to witness Truman Capote's ultimate, spectacular fall from grace. The publication of La Côte Basque, 1965, in Esquire in 1975, and the subsequent social immolation. She missed the final brutal act of the drama she had observed for so long, and this perhaps shapes her legacy in a crucial way. She remains fixed in our cultural memory for those who know her work as the definitive, reliable narrator of a specific vanished world, the world before the betrayal. Her profiles, her talk of the town pieces, and especially the vicious circle, capture the Algonquin wits and the early to mid-century café society milieu at their height, or at least as they wish to be perceived. Her writing preserves the glamour, the wit, the intricate social codes, without the corrosive overlay of Capote's later disillusionment and revenge. Her significance lies in her unique position as the insider-outsider. Born into the heart of New York's cultural elite via the Algonquin, connected by marriage to the establishment power of the Harrimans, she had unparalleled access. Yet through a combination of professional discipline, personal temperament, and perhaps the subtle barriers of not quite fitting the perfect mold, she always maintained a critical distance. She was the perpetual observer, the anthropologist in the drawing room. This position allowed her to create work of lasting value. Unlike the ephemeral gossip columns that fed the daily hunger for society news, Harriman's New Yorker profiles aim for something more enduring. Rooted in meticulous reporting and crafted with literary skill, they provide invaluable nuanced portraits of key figures who shaped the cultural landscape of their time. She captured not just their public personas, but glimpses of the human beings beneath, their ambitions, their mannerisms, their carefully constructed defenses. Reading her work today offers a richer, quieter, less hysterical counterpoint to Capote's more famous but also more distorted portrayal of the same era. Her life also serves as a poignant commentary on the nature of observation itself. Is it possible to truly capture a world without becoming part of it? Can a writer maintain both access and integrity? Harriman's career suggests that it is possible, but perhaps requires a specific kind of temperament, a willingness to forego the intoxicating allure of belonging, to accept the loneliness of the observer's perch. She chose clarity over intimacy, documentation over drama. In the grand narrative of 20th century New York, dominated by louder, more flamboyant figures, Margaret Case Harriman remains a quiet but essential voice. She was the institutional memory, the connecting thread between the boozy brilliance of the Algonquin and the brittle glamour of the Swans. She was the woman who knew everyone, saw everything, and wrote it down with wit, precision, and a fundamental guiding sense of professional integrity. Capote may have delivered the final fatal autopsy of café society, but Harriman provided the indispensable clear-eyed record of its life. Margaret Case Harriman's life began in the literal center of New York's cultural whirlwind, the Algonquin Hotel. Surrounded from childhood by the brightest, sharpest, most celebrated figures of the age, she learned the intricate art of observation, the subtle language of wit, and the crucial difference between performance and reality. As a writer for The New Yorker, she became the indispensable chronicler of her time, profiling the stars of Broadway, Hollywood, and the emerging café society, with unparalleled access and a distinctively witty, insightful, and subtly detached prose. She mapped the glittering world that Truman Capote would later invade and ignite, but she did so as a careful cartographer, not an arsonist. She saw everything, but never mistook the performance for reality, her gaze missing nothing. Her tragedy, if it can be called that, was perhaps the quiet, lifelong ache of the observer, forever witnessing the party but never truly joining the dance. Her legacy is not one of dramatic flameout or legendary scandal, but something quieter and more enduring, a body of work that captures a specific vanished era with intelligence, clarity, and a fundamental respect for the craft of writing and the complexities of human personality. She was the woman who watched Capote's world, understood it perfectly, and recorded its brilliant, fleeting life before the darkness fell. She remains the quiet, reliable witness, her voice a necessary counterpoint to the louder, more tragic figures who ultimately consumed the era she so expertly documented.